Thanks so much, Dominique. We are really excited to be here today. My name is Sina Littlebird. I use she, her pronouns. I am a staff attorney with the Native American Unit at Northwest Justice Project, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's session. We're really excited for the discussion today, and it's nice to see a lot of familiar names in the virtual attendee room. So with that, I think if we could get our slides up, that would be great. And we can go ahead and move on to the second slide, which will provide you all with a brief outline of the session today. I'll start by offering some introductory remarks to ground us in how today's presentation came to be. And then I'll hand it over to our two panelists for them to share some experiences and words of wisdom with us. And then at the end, we'll have some time to dig deeper into the conversation with a question and answer session. I have some questions prepared for our panelists, but I'm really hoping you all will take advantage of their time here today and have your own questions for them as well. As Dominique let you know, feel free to pop questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, or we can you can use your raise your hand function and we can work to get you unmuted to ask your question orally. I think one other quick note before we jump in is that you may have noticed that in the conference agenda that Deb from the Bail Project and the American Indian Community Center in Spokane was actually hoping to join us today, but she had some last minute work responsibilities come up and it prevented her from joining us, and she sends her regrets. So it's too bad to miss her voice, but I think we have a lot to share today anyway. All right, with that, I will turn to the question of why we are here today. Next slide, please. So the legal system was built to entrench the power dynamics of the Western world, right, as is the theme of the conference today. And it perpetuates the concentration of power in the hands of white wealthy men. So in order to achieve those goals, to ensure that only certain folks have access to power and resources, other folks have to go without. Other folks have to be systematically disenfranchised. So if you're a legal services provider working with poor folks or with communities of color, you're trying to help your clients access a system that was not meant for them to access. And not only is the law too often not on the side of our clients, but the entire culture of how legal services are set up makes it hard, if not impossible, for our client communities to be served. For example, because of institutional racism and the white supremacy cultural norms that are steeped into legal services, we require our clients to be on time, have stable modes of communication, fit their life stories into half or hour-long appointment slots, and not be impacted by disabilities, whether that's about accessing our physical office spaces or about things like managing substance use disorders. And if our clients are not able to shape themselves and their lives into these neat dominant culture packages, we tell them we can't serve them, that our hands are tied by court deadlines, scarce resources, our office protocols, et cetera, et cetera. This inability to bend on our part is not the way to live out being client-centered, culturally responsive, or equitable. In fact, those most impacted by the harms of structural racism are those most likely to have the instability, mental health challenges, cultural differences, and other factors that result in the poor fit for how so many of our organizations offer our services. So our practices really just perpetuate the exclusion of poor folks, folks of color, and folks with disabilities from accessing justice through the legal system. And that's how my question came to be. How do we work to serve these clients that don't match the norms of white supremacist culture? Because these are the clients that arguably need our advocacy support even more than those who already fit into and know how to navigate the dominant culture norms of the legal system. Next slide, please. And I came to this question because of historical trauma. And just a note that the discussion about historical trauma is by definition traumatic, and it can be, the material I'm about to cover in this slide and the next slide might be triggering for some, so please be aware of that and feel free to take whatever self-care steps you need to over the next couple minutes. But starting with the definition of historical trauma, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart defines it as the cumulative, multi-generational, collective experience of emotional and psychological injury in communities and in descendants The photo on the slide shows on the left, a Crow mother with her child on the Crow reservation. In the center, a group of African-American slaves. And on the right, a Jewish woman walking toward the gas chambers with 3 young children. And these are the 3 common situations studied for understanding historical trauma. And the research has emerged as critical in understanding and addressing long-term health impacts in these 3 respective communities. Another definition of historical trauma comes from Teresa Evans Campbell, who defines it as the intergenerational collective experience of complex trauma that's inflicted on a group of people who share a specific identity or affiliation, such as nationality, a religious affiliation, or ethnicity. And that definition includes 3 aspects, right? There's 1, the community-wide experience. That 2 is perpetuated by outsiders with destructive intent and results in 3 high levels of collective distress in contemporary communities. So another way of stating this is you have individual trauma histories encapsulated within a larger trauma narrative, and this narrative may accumulate into a multi-generational shared account of events that then have harmful effects on the functioning and quality of life for individual descendants of that community. In my work, I work exclusively with Native American clients, so historical trauma is a big factor. And not all of my clients are impacted, and if they are, it certainly doesn't all manifest in the same ways, but many of my clients do experience the symptoms of historical trauma. And as you'll see a bit clearer on the next slide, the symptoms of historical trauma make folks a really poor fit for the white supremacist cultural model of how legal services are often provided. So go ahead and moving to the next slide. Here I've listed some common causes of historical trauma for Native American communities on the left side, and on the right side, some common results or symptoms of that historical trauma. And I want to reiterate that neither list applies to all Native folks. These are just common examples found in some or many Native communities. So in terms of causes, clear number 1 cause is colonization. You then have different forms of acculturation, assimilation, genocide, smallpox, right? Rampant disease, decimating populations. With Catholicism in boarding schools, you have folks who were punished for speaking their home languages or practicing their home traditions. You have physical and sexual abuse. With boarding schools in particular, you have children removed from their homes, from their families, from their communities, and then not experiencing parenting role models or even caretaking role models. The Indian Adoption Project was a federal government policy in 1958 where states were paid by the federal government to remove Native American children from their homes if they were not deemed quote unquote suitable. And suitable was very much defined by middle-class Anglo cultural norms. And what resulted is many of these children were removed not only from their families, but also from their home communities, because if any culturally Native home is quote unquote unsuitable, that means the entire community is then unsuitable as well. So that's state sanctioned removal of Native children. And then termination refers to another era of federal government policy where the US government was working to remove the distinction of tribal communities, to eradicate tribes as being separate communities, separate legal entities. Another era of federal government policy was relocation, where individual Native Americans were provided one-way bus tickets or train tickets to relocate from their home communities to large cities within the US with the promise of economic prosperity with jobs. Sometimes they were set up with the jobs, other times they weren't. Either way, there was no real support provided to these individuals, and they were often ended up in these cities without community, without connection back home, without a way to get back home, and without the economic prosperity that they were promised. And then, of course, other forms of erasure and invisibility of Native peoples, the lack of seeing accurate histories and textbooks, stereotypes and mascots fall into that as well. In terms of the effects or impacts of historical trauma, these again are not the same for all Native individuals or communities, but the list here provides examples that come up for many of my clients. And before I go into the list, I want to explain that these are the symptoms of historical trauma because of the brain science of trauma. When someone undergoes trauma, they have a physiological response in that it stimulates your sympathetic nervous system and produces certain hormones in your body that enables your body to react in ways that may save your life in an emergency situation. The freeze, fight, or flight response, as we have often learned about it. And if it's just a single stressful event, or if you encounter only intermittent stressful events, your body has a time it needs to return to its home basis state, that state of calm, rather than being in that state of hyperarousal or hypervigilance. But if you experience routine or constant stressors or emergencies, your body is constantly in that hyperaroused, hypervigilant state. And that burns through your body's resources with those stress hormones and shuts down a lot of your executive functioning. Because shutting down your executive functioning helps your brain be more reactive, which is helpful if you're trying to navigate an emergency. So that chronic stress can result in a lot of poor physical health outcomes, can lead to heart attacks, strokes, digestive problems, metabolism problems. The constant hypervigilance can lead to violence, to hopelessness, to substance use disorders, the things you see bulleted on the slide. And just wanted to provide that background to understand why these are the symptoms we see from the causes. As with any traumatic or emergency event, what helps you to get out of it is access to resources, whether that's financial resources or emotional and psychological resources. So when I'm working with a client who may have been impacted by historical trauma or some other form of trauma, I'm trying to think about the way that that history might be impacting their brain and behavior. And I'm trying to think about the ways to give them access to resources to help calm that hyper-aroused or hypervigilant state down, so I can provide them the support they need for their legal issues, or I can help them figure out how to navigate their own legal issue without their trauma responses becoming an insurmountable barrier for them. And that takes me to the next slide. And the takeaway here is I'm still very much learning how to do this and figuring out how to bend legal services to meet my clients where they're at, rather than asking my clients to shape themselves into the packages that are convenient for the white supremacist cultural norms. But to help me in this journey, and hopefully to help you all in your journeys along similar pathways, I've reached out to these two incredible women who have a lot of wisdom in this area. I have seen Colleen and Nwishtamai be both expert at serving folks who are often turned away by legal services, but then also expert at connecting folks to receive legal services. So I'm hoping they can provide us tips and best practices with each of those items. And the image on the slide comes from the fact that I see them both as excellent door openers for clients to services. And the doors can often take a whole lot of energy to push open in the first place and then to keep open for our clients. So I hope you will indulge my cheesy imagery here, but this is how I see you both. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, since I think the stories and experiences they'll share with us today come from a variety of professional and personal identities and experiences. So I want to let you highlight which of those are important for the audience to know in terms of the discussion today. And with that, I will turn it over to you two to share some initial thoughts.
Okay, itamex kanotoni nistoni tane kuno wishtamai. Hello everybody. My name is Nwishtamai Nightgun, the programs director for Chief Seattle Club. Before we start doing some intros, I just wanted to do a prayer before we get into it. Just want to be thankful for this space, for this panel, to be able to talk about some historical traumas, to take the time to pray for everyone that's within this space, to take care of themselves throughout the whole panel. You know, there's information that we're sharing that can be really traumatizing and triggering. So we want to make sure whoever's watching this panel to take care of yourself, drink water, take a walk, and just be mindful that I want to thank the land that we're on presently, or wherever you are. and to the original caretakers of that land, for giving us water, for giving us food, for giving us a place to stay and live, to the original caretakers of it, presently where I'm at, the Coast Salish people, and also give honor to those who were brought here on slave labor. May we respect them in all their endeavors of everything that they have gone through, and what they have been through within these systems. May we represent, their lens. Maybe we represent our ancestors' lens through all of this. And you have questions, please ask those questions. No questions is a dumb question. When you come across this historical traumas, or these systems, everything seems like it can be very uncomfortable, but we need to have those uncomfortable conversations to make sure, like, you understand, and we come to an understanding. And me and Colleen, we work together quite a bit, so I just pray that we're able to give you all the information that you're needed. And even if it's one person walking away from this panel and you were getting information that you needed, that you were able to serve somebody and you changed their life, that's what matters the most. So thank you.
I just want to raise my hands in gratitude for Nwishmai opening us up in that way, and Sina and all the wonderful staff that has actually put the hours and hours of time into this work. I know for Nwishmai and I, we've done these things together so often that it's each time is different, and each time I feel such an immense amount of gratitude for just gathering people together and talking about this. So I just see someone in the comments. There's a lot of people I actually know here, and I didn't realize in my old jobs. So hi, I'm Colleen Chalmers. I am Métis and Lakota on my mom's side. I guess it's hard to, we all talk about relationships and where we work, and how you introduce yourself in different ways. Grew up in San Francisco. I'm in Seattle right now for the last 8 years or so. I do work in Seattle and Portland right now. COVID has sort of changed how all of that works for almost all of us, I know. I worked at Chief Seattle Club with, we've both taken our exits and intros at different times again. But I worked at Chief Seattle Club for about 5 years in the day center. I ran programs and partnerships, and that's how I know Sina and her wonderful crew. Ran the day center there in programming, and Nwishmai ran housing at the time. So the two of us worked together all the time. And so I was at Chief Seattle Club for about 5 years. And then in November, I transitioned over to working with NAYA. It's Native American Youth and Family Services in Portland. And thankfully I can still do that remote right now. So a lot of my experience and understanding comes from both Chief Seattle Club and NAYA. I don't represent either one right now. NAYA, I'm a contract employee, so I just sort of represent myself. I also work at Equity Matters. It's a local justice and equity firm that does educational resources, things like this all the time. So if you guys are ever interested in more work like this, just look up Equity Matters, I think northwest.org, and our awesome leader, Heidi, will hook you up with that. But that's basically it. I am grateful to have a lot of different experience with different organizations, but primarily working with our Native communities. Oh, Sina, do you want us just to, okay. So it's so hard to do this over the computer. I know we all miss just like gathering in person, and Nwishmai's laughing right now because we're both the same. We just like to sit and talk, and she's laughing because it's hard to talk about these things in a really linear way, and to be honest, really linear ways that's also very white systems thinking. So I think just bear with us because we love doing this and we love talking, and we're just gonna go. So let me do this. So keep an eye on what's on the screen, but also I'm just gonna start with the fact that in talking about how we serve this information today, we talked a lot about how this panel is the one that's specifically about best practices, which is probably the most important thing to get from this work is how do you actually apply it to what you're doing. But I feel like it's not possible to talk about best practices without talking about white supremacy systems and lack of justice and lack of equity, because you literally can't have best practices without those understandings. And you know, it's hard because we can't see who's in the audience. And I think it's so clear that everybody brings their own brilliance and their own understandings. And that's such a diverse thing that we all understand things differently and we all bring our own sets of expertise. But I just want to ground us in the fact that you can't talk about best practice without understanding the systems that require those best practices. So you can't talk about best practice without talking about lack of justice and lack of equity. So I just want to ground us in that systems thinking. Best practices serving communities literally requires us to understand historical context, how 1492 and 1619 are present today, that it's not some antique history. And quite candidly, the communities we talk about, our communities are vulnerable because of oppressive systems that we tend to praise people. We either praise people for being resilient through these systems, or we chastise people for failing to overcome these systems. And it's just this perpetual thinking of how to get someone over a barrier when we should also be adjusting our thinking to breaking down that barrier. And if we talk about best practices without that, it's just this empty thing that we can only go so far with. And if you want, maybe you have these brilliant best practices from your experience, but you don't sort of set up that legacy of justice and equity in your wake when you maybe move on from that job, then we're just continuing the cycle. So just questions. I remember probably one of the last conferences Nuishma and I did together, we had somebody ask, this was in Spokane, somebody asked at the end of one of our sessions, and it was similar to this work, like best practices for serving Native communities. And someone asked, I only serve white clients. Do these practices work for my clients too? And it's a fair question. If you don't consider those things on a daily basis and you don't work with, maybe you only work with white clients, it's a fair question. But what I said was treating someone like they're human works for everybody. So I think that's another thing that I hope that we sort of ground ourselves in today, that these might apply differently to each community and they might apply differently to everybody's lived experience, but treating someone like they matter and treating someone like they aren't the worst thing they did and treating someone like their story and your relationship to them matters, that works for everybody, I promise. So like I was actually really grateful he asked that question, because sometimes we don't know how to word that until somebody asks that question. What I want to say is, your clients are already walking through spaces not meant for them. So how can you adjust your thinking and your behaviors and your ways that you operate to meet them with understanding and contextual, especially contextual understanding? They don't need some, we've seen this a lot in our work, and I'm sure that every lawyer has too. They don't need some trauma junkie empathy. And you think about that. You see that in homeless shelters, you see it in courtrooms, you see it on TV and in movies, and you see it in everyday life too. They don't need some like trauma junkie empathy that's going to make a good story. They just need you to understand they're being made vulnerable nearly every turn in this system. and that serving them with care and equity and justice literally requires those systems be changed and somehow reconciled. That's why we talk about relationship and seeing and hearing people and understanding context in the trust relationships. And if you don't know what the sort of capital T, capital R trust relationship means, look that up. And in the context of Native communities, you know, systems in Native communities have a very poor trust relationship, as do the Black communities, as does every other community that's been marginalized and oppressed by these systems that were put into place. So we, you know, want to talk a lot about trust relationships and relationships instead of transactional ways of serving clients. And then just over the weekend, I was watching, there's a good documentary called True Justice on HBO Max, if you have access to that. And I'm a fan of so many different people sort of in this game. And I would say that Bryan Stevenson, the reason I chose a quote by him is because he very much, in my view, he walks in both worlds. He's not per se like an abolitionist who believes the system should be torn down. He's a lawyer and he understands how to work in the system with care and sort of like this fierce love for his clients. So I really love this from him. He says, I think it's important that we understand all the brutal details, all the ugly details, because those are the things that actually give rise to what might allow us to one day claim something really beautiful. And that's it, right? That's, you know, sometimes you hear people who say you just want to move on and start from where we are now, but you literally can't. And that mindset is what's keeping us here. I guess the next slide has some more. See, we're just talkers, so it's not going to be perfect to the slides. It's just not. But I do enjoy when I watch these things. I love when people put some notes on the screen, so you can read that later. You can take a picture. I don't know. But you know, we talk about, like I said, we can't talk about solutions and best practices without acknowledging and actually understanding, not just like Wikipedia level understanding, but actually understanding systems that got us here, and that they're the same systems that we breathe every day. It might look and feel different, but it's the exact same system that 1492 and 1619, that it's the same systems that allowed for that we're still breathing that air today. Understand the historical context of your work and all the roles that your work, that, you know, even the role that you're in today, no matter how brilliant and loving you are, even Bryan Stevenson, he's still working in a role that has previously upheld these systems and is still upholding these systems. You know, I think it should be required understanding that basically every system that we're in now has evolved or reformed from something dripping in white supremacy. And I know that's if you haven't spoken or heard things like that before, that seems really abrupt, but it's true. And if that doesn't sit, it's so hard to see like who's in the room right now, but if that doesn't sit right with you, like sit with that discomfort and ask yourself why that might be uncomfortable, and then do your best to think of the privilege of why that's uncomfortable and not like real to you, and then do your best to educate yourself on, oh, actually, I can see how the child welfare system today kind of looks a lot like residential schools and boarding schools. Like take your time to see the links between things, because I promise you they're there and not as invisible as you would think. You know, the systems that aren't abolished just reform into something else. And that's why the word reform is such a dangerous thing when you talk about actual best practices of serving people, because it just perpetuates the same thing. It just looks, you're just putting it in a pretty box with a pretty bow on top, and it's the same thing. And we'll talk about zero-sum fallacy later on, I guess. You know, more often than not, you're working with somebody who's moving through a system, not only is it not meant for them, but it's a system that was specifically designed to erase them and see them lose. So, you know, sometimes you hear that rhetoric that this is not who we are and the system is broken. And I guess that's depends on your definition of broken. But if you look at the system and you know the system, and I know most of the people on this call here, you know the system, you know that it's in many ways it's actually working exactly as it was designed. Systems that are seeped in a legacy of racial violence and bias, origin of these systems really banked and still bank on ensuring someone or a group of people lose. They bank on the narrative that someone is less than or not human. That's sort of the zero-sum fallacy. You know, think of manifest destiny, colonization, genocide, slavery. Every atrocity, whether it's a big system or a big event, or even the small ones you might not notice, every atrocity requires a justification, and that justification is held up and coddled in the legal system. And that's my thinking outside of the legal system. But I also think that it's okay to believe that and still work in this system, because otherwise it's just going to be something ugly, and that's not what we want. That's not why all of you do the work that you do. I presume you all do the work you do to really love and care for people who are experiencing something that you have an expertise in, that you can support them with. So if that's the mindset that you start with, I think you can find yourself in that space where you can work on understanding that historical context. You know, more often than not, the justification, you know, what normalizes and what gives social currency to an atrocity is actually written into laws, and I know you all know that. You know, we talk about Dred Scott decision in 1857. We talk about, what was the other one? I just wrote down a couple this morning. You know, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson turned into Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. I know you all know that. So think about like how these things evolve and reform. And when you think of like a lot of people, I remember, you know, learning about these things just when I was younger, and they say Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. And sort of, yeah, but it just deemed like the public school and educational facilities portion of racial segregation to be unconstitutional. It didn't address anything else, really. It wasn't until about 10, 15 years later with the Civil Rights Act that was officially addressed. But we all know that the Civil Rights Act is still not, it's still not creating a just and equitable world for people to walk in. I think for what I'm trying to say also is that like a functioning criminal justice system, and I guess you can go to the next slide. I don't think it really matters. But if you like to read along, some of that is what I wrote out. More often than not, you know, you're working in a system that legally allowed for these things to exist. A functioning criminal justice system allowed for lynchings, and a functional criminal justice system allows now for lynchings in a reformed way. You all probably know a million times more than me about the McCleskey versus Kemp Supreme Court decision. I think it was 1987. You all know more than me about that. So just from my small amount of understanding about it, I invite you to like think about that in the context of your work too. It sort of gave this doctrine of inevitability, and how sort of racial bias in executions was this understandable thing because it was just inevitable to have racial bias. And it was, the racially disproportionate impact was not enough to stop an execution. And I think that was in 1987. So you all know more about that than I do, but I'm just inviting you to think about it in that way. You know, the mythology of racial difference survived formal abolition of slavery. You know, our fabric of society, our legal justice system still violently reinforced an evolution of slavery in a multitude of ways. You know, systems of racial terror evolve, they don't go away. That's sort, I know it's all sort of the same thing said many different ways, but I think, at least for me, that's really helpful in learning and understanding context. Every person has different access points to this work, and they have different access points to understanding and caring about different, you know, portions of things. So I hope that's a helpful grounding. I have a couple like best practices that I also, you know, we can talk about too. Nwishtamai has so many that, you know, in the last year, I work with NEA, so I do a lot of client work, not in person right now. So for Nwishtamai, she has more experience just like currently right now. So I know she has more to speak on with housing. I will say that later on, we can also talk about like what access points to injustice look like. I think about best practices. This was, you know, take like George Floyd's case, and how many access points, and I don't mean this in a good way, I mean this in a violent way. How many access points do people have to injustice? You know, it wasn't just that the police arrived and murdered him. It was that, like, go backwards in that day. He went to go buy cigarettes. His money looked counterfeit. Someone called like the boss came over, and someone called the cops because the boss didn't believe that it was didn't believe it was a real 20 or something. And then that phone call was made to the police, and then the police came, and every access point that people get trapped in of injustice, and it's not just that one thing. There was a case, there was a situation a couple years ago, Nwishtamai and I witnessed with one of our clients, where he was beat up by the police in Seattle. And we talked a lot about it as a team, that the access points to that injustice wasn't just him being violently treated. It was that he jaywalked, and a cop thought, oh, let me approach this person. And it's every single access point to injustice. It's not just that one time. And that's where you talk about racial bias and economic bias too, you know, all kinds of things that people perceive that up your access point to injustice. So that is my, that's what I wanted to say to start out with. I would love to share more best practices after Nwishtamai speaks. I know that she has way more in terms of just housing than, so I'm just grateful that we're doing this together. We can go back and forth. We riff better that way.
I appreciate that. Colleen and Stina, I didn't know if you wanted us to start just talking about, you know, the questions that you wanted to ask. Did you want to ask them first, and then we can kind of just hop into it?
I would say if you can start with the like 4 different topic answers and thoughts about those, that would be great. And then I have the additional questions to ask you guys afterwards if our audience is shy. And if you're up for it, we can go ahead and take down the slides so it can feel more conversational too between you two.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Is that all right? Thank you, Dominique.
So, you know, so I've been working with Chief Seattle Club, you know, she's going on 4 years pretty soon. And I'm overseeing the programs, all of the programs actually, housing, kitchen, day center, Native Works, you know, all of those different various programs. And like, you know, Colleen was touching on access points when it comes to, you know, legal services. And I was actually talking to one of my employees this week about it, about how we don't have enough people helping our own people with filling out documents, with filling out paperwork. And Colleen shared a really compelling story. And I remember that day because I was just walking out of a meeting with our current executive director, Derek Belgard. And I seen 7 cops on the street. And the horrible thing about it was, you know, it was right in front of the club, right in front of Chief Seattle Club. And then I jaywalked across the street to see what was going on. I jaywalked across the street to see what was going on. And, you know, I walk up and you have these cops who are laughing, taking pictures, shoving this member, and then telling us, you know, he attacked us, you know, because I'm over there asking them what happened. And, you know, it was so messy. It wasn't necessary. This person, you know, they had significant health problems, mental health issues, and like, you know, maybe he was in and out of the system, but, you know, you can identify that, you know, even getting the video of it was hard to get that. Colleen had to get a lawyer to subpoena it. And that was a whole process just to do that, to help our member, because they were throwing him in there, you know, for assaulting a police officer. And, you know, for those crimes, it's really about, are they going to trust the brown person, or are they going to trust, you know, a bunch of cops who are all standing around? And it was a really hard process for all of us to kind of go through that. And, you know, that's just one of many stories. There's been stories of sexual violence that happens within our communities, and that all came from boarding school systems and colonization being taught to us, you know, in boarding schools. I've even heard my relatives who went to boarding schools about how they would see other children get raped. They would see other children, you know, get the hair chopped off or be cleaned by bleach and be scrubbed on their skin until it bleeded. And you grow up with that mentality from age 3 all the way till 18. You come back, you get married, you know, you start a family. What is your usual? Your usual is violence. So perpetuated communities, they couldn't kill us right away, so they killed us using our own people, creating that within our communities, of creating domestic violence, sexual assault, you know, that continues today. And since it's such a high rate, you know, even reporting it to, you know, like Seattle Police Department on, you know, we have someone here who's a victim of sexual assault, can you come down? They'll be rude. There's us professionals in the same room as this person experiencing significant trauma, and we're trying to help them with this access point of getting them services, of helping them out. And they don't believe them because they said they smell like alcohol, or, you know, they'll blame it on something. It's always something. I've worked with this person before. Oh, they got mental health issues. That has nothing to do with this isolated event right now. And I feel like, you know, me and Colleen, we've done this on, you know, different various panels and different various providers, just to share the stories and give people kind of a narrative and paint a picture of like what we see. What I heard best was from an elder. She said walking out of the house and going to work is like going through 1,000 cuts, because each day, you know, you're not just going out, you're not just working, you're actually experiencing a cut throughout the day. Even my name, you know, people are like, do you have a nickname? Be like, my name is Nwishtamai. It's valuable, it's important, comes from my elders in my community. It was my grandmother's name and it's handed down. You know, I get a lot of pushback on that. And, you know, some people, they call me Wish for short, and they ask if it's okay, but it's not, because the name has meaning, you know. But I just feel like really grateful for this opportunity to share these stories and be able to present with Colleen to talk more about, you know, how working with legal services has been really impactful, how these access points have been identifiable in a barrier to people's lives, to Indigenous lives, to Black lives, to marginalized populations, and how we've had to kind of move around the system and keep doing this. Not just because, you know, we have the experience and the stories of it, but to do this so we can get to know, you know, lawyers like Sina, you know, lawyers throughout Washington State and wherever we go, so we can connect them to communities, because that's what it's about, is connecting back to communities for service providers to understand the cultural background and the cultural history of, you know, why some people are the way that they are, why we have to change our scope of care of the work that we're doing, just so we can adapt to systems that are made for them.
Thank you for that. I actually want to jump in on that last note real quick with a question. May I do that? Nwishima, you mentioned, you know, there's always an excuse to turn someone away, right? That their breath smells like alcohol or they have mental health issues. How have you guys in your programs working with clients created the space and the grace, the compassion for your clients under the, you know, within the constraints of the under-resourced nonprofit system?
Like, how have we walked, like, how have we advocated in a sense with a larger entity?
Yeah, within your own organization about this is why, you know, we need to give this, allow this client through our doors, and we need to, you know, let this client miss a few appointments and still continue making appointments with the client, those types of things.
I think it sounds, I mean, it sounds vague and sort of like grandiose, but just like having your clients back, that can't be said enough. You know, Nwishima mentioned how, you know, talking about cops or any other sort of entity of authority, even sometimes if it's a public defender or someone, you know, along those lines, all of that is still a trauma response to someone experiencing trauma. And she, you know, she mentioned sometimes how rude they can be, or how just those situations. And I think of one time where, and Nwishima will remember this too, we had a member come into Chief Seattle Club a couple of years ago when we were both working, and she disclosed to us that she had been sex trafficked and that she wanted to speak to us, and she did want to report. That was always an option, to not report, but she did want to report. So luckily we did have a domestic violence counselor at the time, and she was really brilliant and careful with that kind of work. And I'll never forget the story that we heard afterwards, that first of all, they waited for hours and hours and hours. This is a police example. I know it's not a lawyer example, but it's just, what I mean is, in that room, the police basically ended up telling her that she couldn't, they couldn't categorize it as a sex traffic, because one of the people, the person who was sex trafficking her, she had a couple months prior disclosed to police in a different situation that that person was her boyfriend. And because she had on record some sort of relationship with this person, they couldn't possibly determine that it was sex trafficking. And I remember, and this is another on my sort of list of best practices to bring up today, this is one of them, having the DV advocate in there is really, very sadly, in a very violent way, think about this, it's really one of the only reasons that she walked out of there with some semblance of protection. And these are the most people I've ever met. They often, they know how to take care of themselves, but people are tired. Think about when you're at your most vulnerable, and you're tired of having it come from every direction it's coming at you, and you could be the most resilient, strong person there is, but we have to think about, like, instead of clapping for someone who's resilient, let them be tired, let them be, and let them be taken care of. And knowing that this person who we all worked with, and she was really brilliant with this work, knowing that she was there to say, no, that's not how it works. That's just not how it works. And having that person there who it's literally their job to say, that's not how it works. I think that can't be overstated. That can't be said enough, to just put weight in having someone's back. Because quite sadly, quite unfortunately, they believe a DV advocate over the and they don't always believe a DV advocate, but just, I guess, using whatever weight in a situation you have and having your person's back. I think that's what comes to mind when you ask about how to navigate some of that.
I agree. That was a really good question, Sina. And, it's something we come across at Chief Seattle Club. And I think, when I first started working there, I wanted to make it more of like community. And when I started running the housing department, it was always about story first. How they're coming in. Sometimes people, they're holding on to this stuff so much that coming in and even seeing you across the table, you get that hour, this is your time, at the club, whatever time you need, if you need to sit down and you need to unload some things, this is the first time somebody's probably giving them that platform to listen. And I think that's really big for providers to think about, is like, we don't know where people's mental health is. We don't know where people's trauma is, and they're in survival mode, and they've come to a place where, like, oh, you're representing me, you're my advocate. All right. When they hear that, of course, they're in survival mode too. And they want to be able to say, this is all the things that are going on with me, from the start to the beginning, sometimes work in the middle and then go from there. We never know how people are feeling. But there's been times where, like, I've sat in my cubicle back then and I've worked with people and they'd be like, I just need to talk to you. And that's all it would be, is like 45 minutes, maybe 2 hours, who knows, of like them talking to me and telling me some things that they haven't been able to unload. And I think that's the biggest thing, is when we're talking about working with the community, when we're talking about marginalized populations and people who've been unequitably been treated through like any of these systems, we need to think about, this is another system. And this can be very like daunting, and like it can take a lot to maybe bring down their walls of defense and make it a safe place for them. That's the most important thing, is making it a safe place for them, of like reiterating their strengths. But, I say reiterating strengths because I definitely don't want to enable trauma, to enable, and take that opportunity of like, oh, I'm so sorry. We're not pitiful when we're coming in. You definitely want to amplify, if somebody were to come in, and this is a story of like a woman came in and she was sex trafficked. And she came in and she's like, I've been on heroin for almost 36 years. She's like, I've been sex trafficked by my husband. He's like, I can't go through the legal systems. I can't get help. I've never had housing on my own. And, you got this elder sitting across from me. And I was like, wow, it sounds like you've survived a lot. You're very strong. You survived many years of using a drug, and you don't know what you're putting in your system or whether or not it's laced with something, and you could have died. I was like, you never know if, something could happen with one of these tricks. You just don't know. I was like, so you came in this office and took the opportunity to unload something very big. And I want to help you on your journey and give you the tools, but I'm walking alongside you to do that. So I think, we all kind of experience, sometimes members won't come in, or, maybe members, they're having a bad day mentally, and they're using, utilizing either drugs or alcohol or whatever, or they're not taking their meds. It could be anything. They don't show up for a few weeks. What we do is always be pleasant, like, man, it's so good to see you finally. You're finally here. Let's pick up where we left off. This is what we were doing last. Are you ready to do that? Making it very strength-based, making it very community. What I appreciated about working at the club is like knowing people by their tribes, knowing people by who they are, their identity, and making sure that that's important, and making other providers know that that's important, because you feel seen, you feel heard, when you're telling them these things. So I think that would be my answer to the question, is like, maybe not have such strict policies when it comes to seeing people. Maybe not stay within that service model of, this is an hour, we need to do this paperwork, I need to ask these questions, I don't want to hear about anything else, because then you're going to miss a lot. Because maybe they'll forget questions, maybe they'll forget some answers between those questions when you're talking with them.
Thank you for that.
And
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, just one thing that I thought of, Nuishma mentioned her cubicle, and I just like, I remembered that space, and something came to me, was that we had a DSHS financial worker with us mostly every day for about 4 hours or so. And just, I mean, that's a story for another day, but I just can't stress enough how your services should be accessible at the time they're needed. So that's one thing. But also the sort of cultural competency and cultural humility, it's a lot of people, including myself, would argue that you can't really be culturally competent in someone else's culture. So just to work on like cultural humility of understanding differences and the nuances of someone, and that's why relationship is so important. Like Nuishma said with story first, if you get to know people, like focus on that cultural humility of understanding when they say like, yes, something's true, or no, something's not true, understanding like what they mean in that context. The financial worker, a lot of times she would work with people who were declined, what is that in the financial services, and where when she would help them, and actually we had an SSI and SSDI lawyer who would do the same thing. If they were declined for something, because on the phone for their application, when the person on the phone would ask, oh, can you work, or can you do this? And for many people in our community, culturally, it's a very weird place to say, no, I can't do that. Or especially for our men and women in sort of different but and also similar ways. It's sort of our elders too, to say no, I can't work, or no, I can't help. That's a very strange cultural thing for our community. So they would often just say, oh yeah, I could probably do a little bit, or I could do that. And I hate to use the word pride, because it's not just about pride, it's about community. But I guess pride is a easy way to sort of understand it. So and then she would look at their case and she's like, what are you talking about? You can't do that. We know based on our relationship, I know that you can't work 8 hours a day. I know you can't stand on your feet for 8 hours a day. I know that maybe you have a disability or some pain in your hands, that you can't do that for 8 hours a day. I know you can't do that. And it was declined because they said, oh yeah, I can do that. I can help. This is community. That's what you do. So it's and then it's also that perpetuation, like where it's that thing where then they're looked at like they're lying, and it creates this really violent cycle where everything out of their mouth is questioned in a very transactional and not a relationship kind of way. So however, if you're a public defender here, or whatever kind of law you practice, or however you practice, if you can look at things as culturally humble and understanding that context, and the most relationship way you can look at things, do your best to do that, because we all communicate differently. And I think that not just like access to things in terms of meeting someone where they're at physically, and you could talk about access points all day, but also learn how your client communicates. And the only way to know that is to have relationship with them and to hear their story first, like Nwishtumai said. And when they say, oh yeah, I can probably do that or something like that, you understand what they mean and where that's coming from too, not just some trauma junkie point where you like understand colonization, but you actually understand where that person got that behavior and got that coping mechanism from, both good and bad, because those are also things that are really positive about our community, that they want to be there for people. So just understand how your person communicates, because it's not all the same.
Thank you for that example. It's really illustrative. I definitely want to open it up for questions from the audience, and we already have a couple. One question is, what is your recommendation for organizations that are client-facing and want to be client-centered for our Indigenous folks, but also are hesitant to do direct outreach to Native folks because they want to be ready to receive Native folks correctly? My gut is a balance of this, since our people are in need, but you are my elders in this area.
I think I heard it best is making an environment where people feel like that is a place that they could go, that they are valued in their voice, more than anything, and not make it look so, I guess, clinical when you're going in there. Even having, artwork or, making a space that, you're not just like taking the time to have people come out there and give you some cultural competency, because going in it blindly can be, really traumatizing for the experience of working with, Indigenous people. And if you start working with them, making sure that you understand the tribal history, the protocols of how they communicate, I think that's really important.
I think one thing, and it relates to this as well, and sort of practices that rules and regulations or practices that you have in, whether they be like day centers or court ordered things for a case. A couple years ago, we actually had I can't remember who it was with now. We had a listening session with, was it Public Defense in Nwishtumai? I think it was King County Public Defense. They did a listening session with us, and so many good things came from that. And I wish that maybe this was right before COVID. I don't know. We didn't get to do a part 2 or part 3 or part 4, and I wish we had. But one brilliant thing that came from that, and it wasn't even from me or Nwishtumai, it was from one of our members, and that's what I hope people remember too, is that people are experts in their own life. One of our just brilliant members that I actually miss so much, and she brought up like, what can we do to help reconcile some of these misunderstandings, which I don't think is her responsibility, but I think that also know that people are coming from that perspective more often than you might think, that they want to make it work. But what she brought up was, for court ordered things, and when I managed programs and partnerships, we would pay for these kinds of things all the time. If someone had like anger management from court ordered, or a domestic violence class court ordered, things like that, we would pay for those. And first of all, those are way too expensive. And second of all, they're kind of limited in how you mark that box off. If it was like AA, you had to go to a specific AA. And what I would encourage, and I guess this is a court issue too, but I'm sure you all have some leverage in this as well as public defenders, or any type of law that you're practicing. For court ordered things, consider accepting like culturally ways of checking that box off. Like there's red road Wellbriety groups that the easiest way is to say it's like native AA, but it's so much more than that. There's different talking circles, and these things can be found many places. If they're in Seattle, I would suggest they go to Chief Seattle Club. If they're somewhere else, there's plenty of ways they can try and access these things, but consider accepting different forms of retribution for a line item, if that makes sense. That not everybody is going to be able to heal or work within the one option. So we also have to offer different access points to success in what we require of people.
Thank you for that as well. I love the building on the access metaphor, the access theme, especially. We have another question that I know, Colleen, you've already weighed in on a little bit, but want to offer to you, Nowishtamai, if you have things to add. We have someone from the audience who loved the points made about all the expectations legal services puts on clients, you know, having consistent contact information, transportation, showing up to appointments on time, et cetera, office hours. Do you have thoughts on how funders could become more client-centric as they fund projects and how those projects are designed?
Oh, I love that question. What's great about that is, you know, before we even, you know, sign a contract for funders, what we do is like have funders, you know, come out to our community, come out to our community events, our memorials, our traditional feast day, meet the members themselves, and then I bring them in. So one, they know about our community. Two, they kind of understand of like, you know, the work that we're doing. And then three, going over the contract with them and letting them know, hey, you know, this fund source isn't going to work for us for the following reasons. The access points for like homelessness, you know, that's a great one to think about too. When it came to like King County and it came to tribal designations and pushing people to make sure that they have their identity in there. You know, we had to take years of journey to make sure like, you know, everybody within the county knew, you know, everybody was on the same page. And with our funders, you know, we take them on that same journey to make sure like they understand the narrative, they understand who they're funding. We're not just going to be throwing up some data or some service metrics to please the contract. We're here to make sure like we're serving the community, and that's the utmost importance. And like if we're leaving funding on the table because it doesn't work for our community, that is exactly what we're going to tell them, you know. And if they want to change the way that they have the service metrics or that the way that they want to fund us, then, you know, we will do that too. But we have to make sure like all of our programs are culturally relevant and we're not just accepting money from everywhere.
Thank you. And Colleen, do you want to reiterate what you posted in the chat answering that question, or add any additional thoughts? Advice for funders? I would say
Nowishtamai has dealt with funders more than I have, but in my experience with funders, or we once had somebody who did our grant writing, and she would always ask us like, okay, so how many people were like, you would have to answer the question like, how many people were healed, or how many people had success with that? And it's so hard to answer that question. And I would invite like funders or contract holders to reconsider like what their definition of success is, because it's not linear, it's cumulative. And we look, you know, maybe somebody went to a Red Road Wellbriety group or AA, maybe they went like every week for 3 months, but like right now they're not sober, right now they're not doing well. That's still a success for their life. That's still something that they took the time and energy to make happen for themselves. It's still something that helps to heal them. So just changing the metric system, I guess, for you know, the charts and the things you have to check off in like a list of what got done with X amount of funding. Just change the way you look at those metrics. I would just into and ask yourself why you're requiring certain things. I think for every rule or regulation you have, and almost every, even just working with your clients as lawyers yourself, ask yourself, like, are there things that we can do differently? Are there things that we can change the metric system for? And if it's not working for my client, or for, in the terms of offenders, if it's not working for this organization, how can we change it so that their success is seen in a metric that we unfortunately have to work within? So just change the way that you interpret that, I guess.
Thank you for that. I have another final question for you guys in our last 4 minutes, and it's a big question for 4 minutes. But just give us what thoughts you can. Thoughts about making sure communities of color support each other in this work. How do we deal with horizontal oppression in this work?
Wishma, do you want to go, or what do you want to do?
While you guys are thinking about this, I do want to point out that that I love this question because it actually came up in the conference planning for this session, that this session is very Native community focused, and feeling self-conscious about that fact. And for me, really recognizing that, yes, my work does focus on serving Native clients, but I could do a lot better job at building those relationships with community providers who serve other communities of color.
It's such a big question. Horizontal oppressions. Colleen, do you want to start it out?
I mean, if you bring it back to, there's 2 different ways that you can and should learn about this and speak about this, right? There's systems ways of learning and speaking, and then there's relationship ways of learning and speaking. And the one thing I always say about this is, like, and my thing is always going to go back to historical context. What happened in 1492 allowed for 1619. What happened in those 2 years, if you just look at what happened in those 2 years, the communities are inextricable. Not to mention the fact that there are many beautiful communities who are Black and Native and Asian. There are many people who hold multiple identities, and I know feel sort of stuck sometimes and not seen. And I think the only way to start the conversation is saying, while there are specific and important and beautiful differences to be celebrated, the communities aren't inextricable. And I think way too often we're looking at this. This is why I wish we had more time. But if everyone read this book, because just in the first chapter, she's an economist who speaks about the zero-sum fallacy was literally created because the enslaved African people and the poor working white people were getting too chummy, and they were working too much together. So they had to create this, right? I remember I said just there has to be justifications for an atrocity. They had to create this thing where they would fight each other. So they created a thing where they would fight each other. And so if we realize all of that is false, and the system doing it is the same system that's been doing it, then you know where to redirect your energy.
Thank you for that. And again, big question for our final few minutes. I appreciate the quick thinking on your toes there. Thank you to everyone who attended today. I think we're all, encourage folks to reach out after the fact with questions or to continue the conversation. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you, Colleen and Nwishtamai, for your time and your effort and your work. I'm so grateful to have shared this space with you today. So thank you guys.
Absolutely. It was good talking with all of you and sharing. Would love to have more time with anybody who wants more time.
I know. We got to do it 2 or 3 hours. You can't do this to it. Nwishtamai and I. And we always prefer hearing from people. So it's really hard for us not to hear from you. Just know that if you've sat there and listened to us and you've soaked this all in, we very deeply appreciate you and hope that you will contact us if you need.
Absolutely.
Or reach out to someone in your community, because everyone does this differently and everyone has a different set of brilliance. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Colleen, for putting your email in the chat. There were so many takeaways, so I'm glad we can continue this conversation. So again, thank you all for attending. We are at time. I hope you found this as insightful and thought-provoking as I did, and that you continue to enjoy your conference experience. So thank you all.
Thank you.